14 kilometers of reinforced rockcrete separate this chamber from the surface. I know because I supervised the installation of the third reinforcement layer myself, back when I still moved freely between levels. That was 16 months ago, perhaps 17. The chronometers here maintain ship time rather than planetary rotation, and after enough cycles, the distinction stops mattering. What matters is that we are deep enough that the orbital bombardments register only as distant tremors through the deck plating, felt more than heard, a rhythmic pulse that could be mistaken for the facility's own heartbeat if you didn't know better. The ventilation system produces a sound. A low mechanical hum, constant, cycling through filters that strip the recycled air of anything resembling freshness before pushing it through the command levels. When I first descended to this posting, the sound bothered me enough that I logged a maintenance request. Nobody responded. After 3 weeks, I stopped noticing it. After 6 weeks, I realized the silence would be worse. The hum means the system functions. Silence would mean failure, and failure at this depth means suffocation long before rescue could reach us, if rescue would be attempted at all for a buried command structure on a world already written into the loss. Columns. My designation is Substrategos Valin Cross, attached to the 4th Strategic Operations Cell, Mechanized Infantry Coordination Division. I report to Strategos Major Caven, who reports to High Command aboard the Undaunted Resolve, currently holding position 40,000 kilometers above the planetary surface, outside effective range of the remaining ground-based defense lasers. I've not seen natural light in 463 days. I have not left this facility in 319. I maintain operational readiness through scheduled rest cycles and nutrient intake calibrated to sustain cognitive function without requiring actual digestion time that might interrupt duty shifts. The bunker is my posting. My posting is my existence. I have adapted. The first thing they teach you at the Tactica Imperialis academies on Macraga is that warfare is mathematics. Force multiplication factors, casualty ratios, resource allocation models, terrain advantage coefficients. Every battle can be reduced to formulae. Every engagement produces data that feeds back into the predictive engines, refining the calculations for the next operation. They teach you this before they teach you how to read tactical displays, before they teach you rank structure or supply chain management or how to compose a proper after-action report. Mathematics first, always mathematics. I believed it then. I still believe it now, though belief is perhaps too personal a word for it. I process operations through mathematical frameworks because that is the function I was trained to perform and the system expects me to continue performing it. Whether I believe in the validity of the underlying assumptions is irrelevant to the execution of my duties. The equation does not require faith. It requires input data and produces output recommendations. I provide the input. Command implements the output. The cycle continues. The hololithic display dominates the command chamber, suspended in the air above the primary tactical table, 20 meters wide and 12 meters tall, updating in real time as Vox operators relay data from forward observation posts and orbital auger arrays. The current operational theater encompasses 600 kilometers of contested terrain, compressed into a glowing three-dimensional map that makes comprehension possible. Green markers represent confirmed Imperial positions. Red markers represent confirmed enemy concentrations. Yellow markers represent contested zones where the situation remains fluid. Gray markers represent positions that have gone silent and are presumed lost but not yet confirmed. There are significantly more gray markers than green ones. I stand at my assigned station, third position from the Eastern Access Corridor, with direct Vox link access to 17 mechanized infantry regiment commanders currently deployed across the northern defensive salient. My role is coordination. When High Command designates an operational objective, I translate that strategic directive into tactical deployments, calculating which units possess the current capability to execute the required maneuvers, what supporting elements they will require, what timeline is feasible given current supply line integrity and estimated enemy response patterns. I compose the orders. I transmit them through the Vox network. I monitor compliance and update the casualty projections as reports filter back through the chain. The chamber operates continuously. 73 personnel maintain 3 rotating shifts, ensuring constant coverage across all operational cells. The night cycle exists only as a designation on the duty rosters. The lights never dim. The hololithic projectors never deactivate. The Vox channels never fall silent. Somewhere in the 600 kilometers of hell rendered in clean geometric precision above us, men are dying every moment of every day, and their deaths must be recorded, tallied, analyzed, and integrated into the next calculation cycle. We do not pause for grief. We do not pause at all. I was born on Corvin 3, a secondary manufacturing world in the Ultima Segmentum that few outside the Administratum cartography divisions would recognize by name. My father operated metal pressing equipment in Foundry Complex Sigma 7. My mother sorted component parts in the same complex, different shift rotation. I saw them 4 hours per week during the overlap period between their schedules and my Schola attendance. That was normal. That was sufficient. The Imperium functions because millions of individuals perform their assigned functions without requiring excessive personal accommodation. I tested well. Aptitude assessments identified strategic thinking capability and tolerance for extended information processing. At 14, I was transferred from general education track to a preparatory academy. At 16, I received my commission candidacy and departed Corvin 3 aboard a bulk hauler heading Corward. I have not returned. I do not know if Corvan 3 still exists. The last I heard, the sector had been designated contested, but that was 6 years ago and the information was third-hand. It is possible the world still produces components for the war machine. It is possible it has been consumed entirely. The distinction does not affect my current operational parameters. The Tactica Imperialis Academy occupied a fortress monastery on Macragge that had been converted to military education purposes after the original occupants relocated to a newer facility built into the polar mountains. The halls still bore the marks of their previous inhabitants. Aquila motifs carved into the stone, phrases in High Gothic declaring various virtues across the archways, that particular smell of incense that clings to architecture even after decades of disuse. We marched those halls for 4 years, learning to reduce human conflict to numbers that could be managed, manipulated, optimized. Instructor Tovar taught applied logistics theory. He had served 40 years in active campaign planning before losing his left leg to a mine fragment on some world whose name he never shared. He walked with a powered brace that clicked against the stone floors with metronomic precision, and he never arrived late to a single lecture. His methodology was simple. He presented scenarios. We calculated responses. He identified our errors with clinical precision, then demonstrated the correct calculation pathway. Repeat until the pathways became automatic. One scenario I recall with specific clarity involved a 3-day offensive across broken terrain where supply lines would be contested. He provided us with force disposition data, estimated enemy strength, terrain analysis, and available resources. The objective was to determine the optimal allocation of available units to maximize territorial gain while minimizing resource expenditure. 27 of us worked the problem for 2 hours, submitting our recommendations through data slates that compiled our answers for comparative analysis. The correct answer, Instructor Tovar explained, involved committing 60% of available infantry in a frontal assault across the primary avenue of approach, accepting projected casualties of 48%, while the remaining mechanized elements executed a flanking maneuver through terrain previously assessed as impassable. The frontal assault would draw enemy fire and force commitment of their reserves. The flanking elements would collapse the enemy position from an unexpected vector, achieving breakthrough at acceptable cost. Total projected casualties: 14,312 Imperial Guard infantry. Territorial gain: 47 kilometers and access to an intact supply depot. My calculation had recommended a more cautious advance along secured routes, staging supply points every 12 kilometers to maintain logistical integrity. Projected casualties: 4,100. Territorial gain: 18 kilometers with no guaranteed strategic assets. Instructor Tovar's assessment of my work was brief. Adequate for survival. Insufficient for victory. The Imperium does not reward caution, Sub-Aspirant Cross. It rewards results. Recalculate. I recalculated. Over time, my recommendations began to align with the expected answers. Casualties transformed from human costs into numerical values, balanced against territorial gains, strategic objectives, timeline requirements. The mathematics became comfortable. When I graduated with honors and received my first posting assignment, I felt prepared to execute my function within the machine. Nothing prepares you for the first time you transmit an order that you know will kill men under your coordination. My initial posting was to the 17th Army Group during the Tervantis compliance actions, a relatively minor theater by Imperial standards. 3 months of low-intensity operations against scattered resistance cells operating out of the industrial sectors of the Planetary capital. I served as Junior Logistics Coordinator, primarily managing ammunition distribution and resupply scheduling for frontline units. The work was tedious but essential. Infantry formations consume vast quantities of ammunition. The consumption rate must be predicted, resourced, and delivered continuously, or operations collapse. During the second month, a mechanized infantry company, Cadian 301st, I still recall their designation, pushed too far forward during a pursuit operation and became isolated in a manufacturing district the enemy had prepared with concealed firing positions. The company voxed for immediate resupply and reinforcement. Their ammunition reserves were depleted below sustainable combat levels. Without resupply within 2 hours, they would be unable to maintain defensive integrity. The situation reached my desk because the standard resupply convoy route passed through a sector we had assessed as pacified but had not garrisoned in strength. Current intelligence suggested enemy activity had increased in that sector over the past 48 hours. The convoy would be vulnerable. I ran the calculations. 3 Chimera transports with minimal escort could reach the isolated company within the required time frame. Probability of successful delivery, 41%. Probability of convoy loss, 59%. Expected casualties if convoy was lost, 47 personnel plus critical ammunition that would take 6 days to replace from regional stockpiles. Alternative option: hold the convoy, allow the isolated company to attempt breakout on their own initiative with depleted ammunition reserves. Projected casualties for the company, 70 to 85%. Projected casualties for the convoy, 0, as it would not be deployed. The mathematics were clear. Losing 47 personnel to save a company of 130 was inefficient. The isolated company had created their own tactical problem through poor judgment in the pursuit. Committing additional resources to extract them from their error compounded the initial mistake. I recommended holding the convoy and ordering the company to execute immediate breakout withdrawal, accepting that the majority would not survive. My supervising officer reviewed the recommendation, approved it, and transmitted the order. The Cadian 301st attempted breakout at dusk. 17 personnel reached friendly lines. The company ceased to exist as an effective fighting formation. I logged the incident in my duty records and proceeded to the next logistical coordination task. There was no time for extended processing. The campaign continued. Other units required support. The system demanded I continue functioning. But I remembered the Vox traffic. I had monitored the tactical channel while the breakout occurred, as was standard procedure for coordination personnel. I heard the company commander, Captain something, I did not retain his name, issuing orders with calm precision, even as his unit disintegrated around him. I heard the individual squad leaders confirming orders, maintaining discipline, executing proper tactical withdrawal procedures exactly as their training demanded, right up until the moment their Vox signals terminated and the gray markers appeared on my tactical display. At the Academy, that scenario would have been assessed as correct application of resource allocation principles. In the command post at Tervantis, it was simply Tuesday. The war continued. I continued with it. Part 1. The bunker on Varath 4 is larger than the facility at Tervantis, significantly larger. The Tervantis campaign was a minor operation. Varath IV is a planetary siege entering its 3rd year with an estimated 400 million combatants currently deployed across 6 continents, contested urban centers that sprawl across thousands of square kilometers, and strategic resources that High Command has deemed worth the expenditure of blood required to secure them. The command bunker reflects this scale. 14 levels, each level dedicated to specific operational functions. Strategic coordination, tactical deployment, logistics management, intelligence analysis, communications relay, Medicaid facilities, personnel management, equipment maintenance, power generation, environmental systems, ammunition storage, food synthesis, water reclamation, and at the deepest level, the high command chambers where Strategos Major Caven and his immediate staff conduct the planning sessions that determine how the next 10,000 men will be spent. I have clearance for 11 of the 14 levels. The high command chambers, ammunition storage, and power generation core are restricted. I have never questioned this restriction. My function does not require access to those spaces. The system operates on need-based information distribution. I accept the data I am provided and execute coordination tasks within my assigned parameters. The tactical chamber where I maintain my duty station operates at a constant temperature of 17 degrees Celsius. This is optimal for equipment performance and human cognitive function according to Monitorum standard environmental guidelines. The temperature does not vary. The humidity remains fixed at 32%. The light panels maintain consistent output measured at 4,000 lumens per square meter. Every variable that can be controlled is controlled. The environment itself becomes part of the machine, optimized for maximum operational efficiency. I arrived at this posting 894 days ago. I remember the descent. The heavy transport Valkyrie that carried me and 14 other staff replacements from the surface landing zone, spiraling downward through 7 layers and a void shield coverage and point defense battery protection, finally settling onto a reinforced landing pad that immediately retracted into the bunker structure and sealed behind us with blast doors 4 meters thick. I remember thinking the fortress was impregnable. Nothing could reach us here. We would coordinate the surface war from absolute safety, untouchable, persistent, the calculating center of the Imperial war machine functioning without threat. That assessment was tactically accurate and psychologically naive. The fortress is impregnable. Nothing has reached us. The war on the surface has transformed from mobile operations to grinding attrition across fixed defensive lines that shift by meters per week rather than kilometers per day. Casualties accumulate, territory changes hands, the hololithic display updates continuously, and we remain here, deep beneath it all, breathing recycled air and monitoring the lights that represent human lives reduced to mathematical abstractions. I met Strategos Major Caven during my first week. He conducted a personal briefing for new staff officers, a practice he maintained despite the inefficiency it represented. Most command officers delegated such tasks to subordinates. Caven insisted on direct contact. He is a tall man, thin in the way that happens when someone maintains function through stimulants rather than proper rest, with gray hair cropped to regulation length and eyes that tracked across assembled personnel with the same analytical precision he applied to tactical displays. His briefing was concise. You are here because the Imperium requires victory on Varath 4. Victory requires coordinated application of military force across a theater too large for any single human mind to comprehend in totality. Therefore, we function as a distributed intelligence network. Each of you processes a specific subset of the total operational data. You identify patterns, calculate recommendations, and transmit those recommendations up the chain of command. High Command synthesizes your inputs and generates strategic directives. Those directives flow back down to you as tasking orders. You translate strategic intent into tactical execution. The cycle repeats until victory is achieved or the theater is abandoned. You are not warriors, you are processors. You will not carry weapons. You will carry data slates. Your enemy is not the forces arrayed against us on the surface. Your enemy is entropy, confusion, the natural tendency of complex systems to degrade into chaos. You fight that enemy with clarity, precision, and relentless calculation. That is your function. Execute it. Nobody asked questions. There were no questions to ask. The function was clear. I executed my function. Day after day, shift after shift. Vox traffic from the northern salient filtered through my station. Regiment commanders reported position updates, casualty figures, ammunition status, enemy contact assessments. I processed the data, updated the tactical display, calculated coordination recommendations for my supervising officers to review. When strategic directives arrived from High Command, I translated them into deployment orders specifying which units would advance, which would hold position, which would be held in reserve, what supporting elements each formation would require, what timeline they were expected to operate within. The orders I transmitted were clear, precise, professionally formatted according to Munitorum standard communication protocols. They contained grid coordinates, unit designations, movement timelines, objective descriptions, rules of engagement parameters. They did not contain names. They did not describe the terrain those coordinates represented in terms a human being walking through it would recognize. They did not account for fear, exhaustion, grief, rage, or any of the 1,000 variables that make human beings something other than perfect calculating machines. The orders were clean, the mathematics were sound. The men who received them died in numbers the equations predicted with remarkable accuracy. Casualty reports arrived through a separate Vox channel, managed by personnel assessment officers on the level above my station. The data flowed into the central processing core where logistics teams calculated replacement requirements, medical teams estimated recovery timelines for wounded personnel, and strategic planning teams updated force availability projections for future operations. I did not manage that data stream directly, but I saw the outputs. Every morning when I arrived at my station, the hololithic display showed overnight casualty updates reflected in the adjusted unit strength indicators. A regiment that had been marked at 83% effective strength yesterday would show 77% this morning. The display updated the number. The operations continued. 6 months into my posting, I met Medici Lieutenant Corvin. He maintained a duty station on the Medici level, managing triage protocols and resource allocation for the surgical teams that handled wounded personnel evacuated from the surface. Our paths crossed in the recaf dispensary, adjacent to the primary lift junction, one of the few spaces in the facility that served multiple departments and therefore functioned as an informal gathering point during shift transitions. He was younger than me by perhaps 3 years, though time in the bunker made such assessments difficult. He had dark hair, already showing gray at the temples, and the particular posture that develops in people who spend too many hours bent over surgical tables. He was preparing a cup of recaf with the mechanical precision of someone performing a routine task, and I was waiting for the dispenser to complete my own cup when he spoke. "You're from Strategic Operations, 3rd Cell, Mechanized Coordination." Not a question, an observation. "Correct," I replied. "You've reviewed my identification, or you recognize me from the personnel briefings. I've seen you at shift transitions. Same time every day, same recaf preparation protocol. I process patterns professionally. It's what Medicaid officers do. Recognize when deviations from baseline indicate systemic problems. He retrieved his cup and turned to face me. Corvin, trauma assessment and resource allocation. Cross, mechanized infantry coordination. The dispenser completed my cup. I retrieved it and stepped aside to allow access for the next officer in the queue. Corvin did not immediately depart. He lingered at the edge of the recaf dispensary, watching the flow of personnel through the junction with the same analytical attention he presumably applied to patient assessment. After a moment, he spoke again. Do you ever wonder about the casualty reports, the numbers we process? The question was imprecise. I required clarification. Wonder in what capacity? The accuracy of the data collection methods? The statistical analysis procedures? No. He paused, reconsidering his phrasing. Wonder about what those numbers represent before they become numbers. I understood the question. I did not understand its purpose. The numbers represent Imperial Guard personnel who have sustained injury or death in the course of military operations. The data is collected to enable resource allocation and force planning. The system requires accurate casualty tracking to function. I know what the system requires. His tone had shifted slightly, though I could not identify the specific emotional content. I manage part of that system. Every number that flows through my assessment protocols represents a human being who was functional yesterday and is now either permanently dysfunctional or temporarily removed from combat capability pending medical intervention. I know what they represent. I'm asking if you do. I considered the question for longer than it warranted. The recaf in my hand had cooled to optimal drinking temperature. My shift began in 4 minutes. I should have departed. Instead, I remained, processing the implication behind Corvin's inquiry. He was asking whether I maintained awareness of the human cost embedded in the data I processed, whether the abstraction had become complete, or whether some fragment of earlier consciousness persisted beneath the professional calculation. I'm aware that the numbers represent individual human beings, I replied. I am also aware that my function requires processing those individuals as numerical values in resource allocation calculations. The Imperium spans 1,000,000 worlds. Individual human experience cannot scale to that magnitude. Abstraction is necessary. The system could not function otherwise. Corvin held my gaze for a moment that extended beyond comfortable professional interaction length. Then he nodded slowly. You're correct. The system could not function otherwise. That doesn't make it less. He stopped, reconsidered. Never mind. Your shift starts soon. I shouldn't delay you. He departed toward the medical level access corridor. I proceeded to my station. The conversation did not recur for several weeks, and when it did, the context had shifted significantly. The war on the surface deteriorated throughout that period. What had been a mobile offensive intended to break the enemy's industrial capacity devolved into siege warfare around 3 major urban centers that High Command designated as essential objectives. The enemy, Heretic PDF, forces reinforced by what intelligence assessments suggested were traitor Astartes elements, though I never saw confirmed identification, adapted their defensive strategies faster than our strategic projections anticipated. They abandoned open terrain, consolidated forces within urban structures that negated our armor advantages, and implemented a defensive doctrine that prioritized inflicting maximum casualties per meter of territorial concession. The casualty ratios shifted unfavorably. Territory that previously cost us 2,000 casualties per 10 kilometers of advance now cost 7,000 per kilometer. High Command adjusted strategic timelines but maintained pressure. The objectives were designated essential. The operation would continue until those objectives were secured or until High Command received new guidance from Fleet Command. My coordination cell managed operations across the northern approach to Urban Center Sigma, designated Priority Objective 2. 17 mechanized infantry regiments, 4 armored regiments, and supporting artillery and logistics elements, totaling approximately 230,000 personnel at the start of the offensive. After 4 months of sustained operations, effective strength had degraded to 147,000. Casualty rates exceeded replacement rates by 40%. The hololithic display showed our frontline positions had advanced 4.7 kilometers from initial start positions. At current consumption rates, we would reach the urban center's outer defensive perimeter in 11 months. Assuming enemy defensive capability did not increase and assuming replacement flow remained constant. Both assumptions were optimistic. I transmitted coordination orders daily. Regimental commanders voxed back confirmation, casualty reports, ammunition status updates, requests for fire support, requests for relief, requests for reinforcement. I processed the requests through priority algorithms and recommended allocations to my supervising officers. Approved requests were fulfilled when resources permitted. Denied requests received standardized response templates explaining resource constraints and directing units to continue operations with available assets. One regimental commander, Colonel Taven of the 88th Varan Mechanized, voxed repeatedly with increasingly urgent requests for relief. His regiment had been committed to holding a fortified position designated Grid Reference 447-Delta for 6 weeks without rotation. Casualty accumulation had reduced his effective strength to 41%. Ammunition reserves were below sustainability thresholds. Enemy contact was continuous. He requested immediate relief and rotation to rear positions for reconstitution. I reviewed his requests against operational requirements. Grid Reference 447-Delta anchored the left flank of the entire northern salient. Loss of that position would expose 3 adjacent regiments to envelopment and potentially collapse the entire sector. Relief would require committing reserve forces that were currently designated for a planned offensive operation in a different sector. The mathematics were clear. The 88th Varan Mechanized would hold Grid Reference 447-Delta until the planned offensive completed, at which point reserve forces would become available for rotation. Estimated timeline: 6 to 8 weeks. I transmitted the denial with standard explanatory template and recommendation that Colonel Taven implement ammunition conservation protocols and request fire support from adjacent artillery positions to reduce direct engagement requirements. Colonel Taven acknowledged the order. His Vox traffic ceased for 3 days. On the 4th day, Grid Reference 447-Delta went silent. All Vox contact with the 88th Varan Mechanized terminated simultaneously. Orbital auger returns showed enemy forces overrunning the position. By the time reconnaissance elements reached the site, the enemy had withdrawn and the fortification was empty except for bodies and destroyed equipment. The 88th Varan Mechanized ceased to exist as a functional unit. The left flank collapsed. 3 adjacent regiments withdrew under fire, sustaining 38% additional casualties during the fighting retreat. The entire northern salient retracted by 2.3 kilometers. I filed an incident report analyzing the tactical situation and recommending accelerated reinforcement deployment to prevent further deterioration. The report was acknowledged and filed. Nobody reprimanded me. Nobody suggested my coordination had been inadequate. The mathematics had been correct. The resources were insufficient for the operational requirements. The system had functioned as designed. The fact that it produced an unfavorable outcome did not indicate systemic error. It indicated resource constraints that exceeded optimal operational parameters. Colonel Taven had not survived the collapse of grid reference 447-Delta. His body was among those recovered during the reconnaissance sweep. The casualty report listed him as killed in action, enemy contact, defensive operations. The number was processed through personnel assessment and logistics recalculation. The system continued. I saw Corvin again in the recaf dispensary 7 days after grid reference 447-Delta fell. He was preparing recaf with the same mechanical precision, but his movements were slower. Fatigue, I assessed. Probably multiple extended shifts processing casualties from the northern salient collapse. The medical level had been operating beyond sustainable capacity for weeks. Cross. He acknowledged me without looking up from the recaf dispenser. I processed 217 wounded from your sector yesterday. That number is accurate within 5%. I don't have the final figures yet from third shift. I am aware of the casualty rates in the northern salient, I replied. The situation has deteriorated beyond initial projections. High Command is implementing corrective measures. Corrective measures. He retrieved his recaf and turned to face me. His eyes were bloodshot, the whites showing the red tracery that indicated either stimulant overuse or insufficient rest. Is that what you call it when you abandon a regiment that voxed for help 6 times and then process the survivors through my surgical bays with injuries that wouldn't have occurred if you'd pulled them out when they first requested relief? The accusation was direct. I required a moment to process the emotional content and formulate an appropriate response. The 88th Varan Mechanized's requests for relief were reviewed against operational priorities and resource availability. Relief was not feasible within the required timeline given strategic commitments in other sectors. The decision was correct per established coordination protocols. The decision killed them. Corvin's voice remained level, but the emotional content had intensified. You calculated that their deaths were acceptable costs. You transmitted orders you knew would result in their destruction. Now I'm repairing the ones who survived long enough to reach my surgical tables, and I'm looking at injuries that are... He stopped, corrected himself. I apologize. That was unprofessional. You executed your function according to your training. The system is the system. I shouldn't direct frustration at you personally. Your frustration is understandable, I replied. Sustained high-casualty operations produce psychological stress across all personnel categories. Medicaid officers experience this through direct exposure to injured personnel. Coordination officers experience it through awareness of decisions that produce those casualties. Both responses are documented in stress management literature. Neither indicates personal failure. Corvin looked at me for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly. You actually believe that? The system has... He stopped again. Never mind. I need to return to my station. People are still dying, and I'm one of the ones tasked with preventing that when possible. He departed without waiting for response. I returned to my own station and resumed coordination duties. The northern salient required immediate attention. Reinforcement convoys were in transit. New regimental deployments needed coordination assignments. The hololithic display updated continuously with fresh data. I processed it all and translated strategic directives into tactical orders that would be transmitted to men who would execute them regardless of their personal assessment of survival probability. The system functioned. I functioned within it. The alternatives were not presented as options. Over the following months, I encountered Corvin periodically in the recaf dispensary and occasionally in the primary lift junctions when our shift transitions aligned. Our conversations remained professional but gradually acquired a pattern. He would reference casualties from recent operations. I would explain the operational logic behind the coordination decisions that produce those casualties. He would express frustration with the mathematics that reduced human suffering to acceptable costs. I would note that the mathematics were necessary for system function. Neither of us convinced the other. Neither of us expected to. But the conversations continued. In a facility where most interactions were purely functional exchanges of operational data, even conversations that went nowhere served a purpose I did not fully process at the time. Corvin represented something anomalous, a person who insisted on processing the human cost embedded in the data rather than accepting the abstraction as complete and necessary. His perspective was inefficient. It was also persistent. And over time, I found myself anticipating our encounters in a way that did not align with my standard operational patterns. I began arriving at the recaf dispensary 3 minutes earlier than my optimal schedule required. This created a higher probability of encountering Corvin during his shift transition. The adjustment was minor. It did not significantly impact my coordination efficiency. I told myself this was coincidental variation in routine rather than deliberate modification to increase contact frequency with a specific individual. I did not believe myself, but I maintained the pattern regardless. 13 months into my posting, High Command implemented a major operational restructuring. The siege had stalled across all sectors. Casualty rates remained unsustainable. Territorial gains had degraded to statistical insignificance. Fleet Command transmitted new strategic guidance, shift from offensive operations to siege containment, while orbital bombardment assets were repositioned to provide fire support for a concentrated breakthrough operation in a single sector. The northern salient, my coordination area, was designated the breakthrough sector. The operation was designated Thunder of Conviction. High Command allocated 40% of remaining planetary ground forces to the northern salient for a coordinated assault intended to penetrate enemy defenses and secure Urban Center Sigma within a 6-week operational window. Success would break the siege deadlock and enable exploitation operations across the entire planetary theater. Failure would The briefing materials did not specify what failure would mean. The implication was clear. Failure was not acceptable. My coordination cell received expanded responsibilities. I would manage deployment coordination for 29 regiments totaling 312,000 personnel, plus attached armor, artillery, and air support elements. The scale exceeded my previous operational scope by a factor of 3. I received 2 additional junior coordinators to assist with data processing and a direct Vox link to High Command strategic planning staff. The bunker's tactical chamber reconfigured to prioritize the northern salient hololithic display. Everything else became secondary. Preparation required 6 weeks. Regiment repositioning, ammunition stockpiling, artillery emplacement, logistics route reinforcement, medical facility expansion to handle anticipated casualty flow. Corvin's medical level received additional surgical teams and expanded trauma bay capacity. The estimated casualty projection for Thunder of Conviction was 74,000 Imperial Guard personnel across the 6-week operational window. Acceptable losses for strategic breakthrough of this magnitude, according to High Command assessment. I processed those numbers the same way I processed all operational data. 74,000 was 37% of committed forces, within acceptable parameters for a decisive operation against a fortified enemy position. The mathematics supported the operation. I proceeded with coordination planning. The night before the offensive began, night being a designation on the chronometer rather than any perceptible environmental change, I encountered Corvin in the recaf dispensary. He was not preparing recaf. He was simply standing near the dispenser, staring at the wall panel displaying facility status readouts without appearing to process the information displayed. Corvin. I approached my standard dispenser position and initiated recaf preparation. You appear. Are you experiencing a medical issue? He turned slowly, as if returning from some distant processing state. Medical issue? No. Just thinking about tomorrow, about what tomorrow means. Tomorrow the offensive begins, I replied. Your medical teams are prepared for casualty processing. You've conducted the appropriate preparations. I've expanded my surgical capacity by 60%, Corvin said quietly. I've requisitioned additional augmetic limbs, synthetic blood, trauma stabilization equipment. I've assigned my most experienced chirurgeons to the primary trauma bays. I've calculated optimal patient flow algorithms to maximize survival rates. And I know with absolute certainty that none of it will be enough. The numbers you're about to create will overwhelm everything I can do to process them. The phrasing was unusual. The casualties are not numbers I create. They are the predicted result of operational requirements balanced against enemy defensive capability. You're transmitting the orders tomorrow, Corvin continued, not acknowledging my clarification. You'll coordinate the advance. You'll send 300,000 men into that urban center. And by the time the operation concludes, 74,000 of them will have transitioned from functional personnel to casualty statistics requiring medical processing or burial detail. You know this. The High Command briefings were explicit about the projected costs. The projections are based on historical data and current intelligence assessments, I replied. High Command has determined the strategic value of urban center. Sigma justifies the projected casualties. My function is coordination, not strategic assessment. I execute the function I am assigned. I know. Corvin finally moved, stepping closer to the recaf dispenser but not initiating preparation. I know you're executing your function. I know I'm executing mine. I know the system requires both of us to continue regardless of our personal assessment. But Cross, he stopped, started again. Do you ever think about what we've become, what this place has made us? The question required processing time I did not have. My shift began in 6 minutes, but I remained because Corvin's inquiry penetrated something I had been deliberately avoiding through sustained focus on operational data processing. We have become what our training prepared us to be, I finally replied. Efficient components within a larger system. Our individual perspective is irrelevant to system function. The Imperium requires we execute our roles without allowing personal consideration to degrade operational efficiency. Without allowing ourselves to feel what we're doing, Corvin said. Not a question. A completion of my thought in words I had not used. I did not respond immediately. The recaf dispenser completed its cycle. I retrieved the cup but did not drink. Feeling would not change the operational requirements, I said eventually. The casualties would remain the same regardless of my emotional state, while coordinating the operations that produce them. Emotional engagement serves no function. It serves the function of keeping you human, Corvin replied. Of maintaining awareness that you're processing lives, not numbers. But you're right, it doesn't change anything. We'll both continue executing our functions. Tomorrow I'll repair the ones you send to me, the ones who can be repaired. The others I'll triage according to resource availability protocols and log their deaths for personnel assessment processing. And the day after, we'll do it again. Until the operation completes or until we run out of men to send into the grinder. He departed without preparing recaf. I remained at the dispenser, holding my cup, processing his words against my operational training. The system required my function. The function required emotional distance. Emotional distance enabled sustained performance across extended operational timelines. This was necessary. This was correct. The recaf had cooled below optimal temperature. I consumed it anyway and proceeded to my station to begin final coordination for Thunder of Conviction. The offensive began at 0400 Planetary time. Artillery preparation commenced 2 hours prior. Systematic bombardment of identified enemy defensive positions across a 40-kilometer front line. The sound reached us even at 14-kilometer depth. A sustained vibration through the bunker structure. Rhythmic, relentless, the compressed thunder of thousands of shells impacting across the urban sectors above. The tactical chamber's audio pickups registered the bombardment as background noise that required filtering to maintain Vox channel clarity. At 0400, the infantry advance began. 29 regiments moving forward in coordinated waves, supported by armor elements and continued artillery fire. The hololithic display tracked their advance through position updates relayed by Vox operators and orbital auger data. Green markers flowing forward into contested yellow zones, transforming yellow to green as positions were secured, encountering red markers where enemy resistance concentrated. I coordinated from my station, maintaining Vox contact with regimental commanders, processing position reports, calculating supporting element requirements, transmitting coordination updates to adjacent units. The data flow was immense. Hundreds of individual reports per hour, each requiring processing and integration into the larger operational picture. My 2 junior coordinators managed routine traffic while I handled exception conditions, units encountering heavier than expected resistance, supply convoys delayed by terrain conditions, casualties exceeding local medical evacuation capacity. The first casualty reports arrived 37 minutes into the offensive. Initial engagement casualties, acceptable rates, within projections. By hour 3, casualty rates had increased to borderline concerning levels. By hour 6, they exceeded projections by 18%. The enemy had concentrated forces in depth, implementing a defense-in-depth strategy that traded urban terrain for maximum casualty infliction. Every building became a fortified position, every street became a killing ground. The advance continued, but the cost per meter increased beyond acceptable parameters. High Command transmitted updated guidance. Maintain operational pressure, accept increased casualties. Breakthrough must be achieved within the strategic timeline regardless of costs. I processed the guidance and transmitted coordination updates to regimental commanders. The advance continued. By day 3, accumulated casualties reached 41,000. Medical evacuation systems were overwhelmed. Corvin's trauma bays operated beyond maximum capacity. I received priority Vox traffic from the medical level, requesting operational pause to enable casualty processing. I forwarded the request to High Command. High Command denied the request. The offensive would continue. Medical personnel would adapt. I transmitted the denial through official channels. Then I used my personal Vox link to contact Corvin directly. Something I'd never done before, a deviation from protocol that I did not fully process before executing. Corvin, this is Cross. I received your request for operational pause. High Command denied. Static, then his voice, strained in ways I had never heard. We can't sustain this, Cross. I have 370 wounded in spaces designed for 140. I'm performing triage in the corridors. I'm deciding who gets surgery and who gets pain management while they die, because I don't have enough chirurgeons or equipment to treat them all. This isn't, I need time. I need the casualties to stop for just 6 hours so we can process what we already have. The offensive cannot pause, I replied. Pausing would enable enemy reinforcement and compromise breakthrough probability. High Command assessment is that continuing pressure provides optimal strategic outcome. Optimal strategic outcome. His laugh was brief, harsh, not actually indicating humor. Tell me, Cross, what's the optimal outcome for the man I just watched bleed out in Corridor 7 because all my surgical bays were occupied and I couldn't reach him in time? What strategic value did his death provide? I did not have an answer that would serve any purpose. The mathematics remained valid. Individual deaths were tragic but necessary. The strategic calculus was sound. I understand your frustration, I said, knowing the words were inadequate. I am aware that you are processing conditions beyond your optimal operational capacity. I will continue monitoring medical evacuation status and recommend priority adjustments when possible. When possible, Corvin repeated. That's all any of us can do, I suppose. Continue until we can't anymore. I have to return to the surgical bays. People are still dying. The Vox link terminated. I returned my attention to the technical displays and continued processing coordination data. The hololithic projection showed green markers advancing slowly through urban center Sigma's outer districts. The advance was working. The casualties were within acceptable parameters. The revised parameters, not the original projections, but within parameters regardless. The system was functioning. We were all functioning within it, executing the roles assigned, calculating the mathematics of human suffering and strategic necessity. Corvin was correct. We would continue until we couldn't anymore. The offensive continued for 18 days before achieving breakthrough. Urban Center Sigma's outer defenses collapsed on day 14. Enemy forces withdrew to prepared positions in the urban core. Our forces pressed forward, consolidating territorial gains, establishing supply lines, preparing for the second phase assault. Total accumulated casualties, 91,417. 23% above initial projections, within acceptable variance for complex urban operations. Strategic objective achieved. High Command transmitted commendations for coordination. Efficiency. My performance assessment received notation for exemplary execution under high-complexity operational conditions. I was informed I would receive priority consideration for advancement to senior coordination roles. I filed the commendations without processing their content and requested 12 hours personal time to conduct maintenance activities. Request approved. I departed my station and proceeded to personal quarters I had not seen in 4 consecutive shifts. I did not conduct maintenance activities. I sat on the edge of my assigned rest platform and stared at the wall for 7 hours, unable to initiate any productive function, simply existing in a space where the Vox channels did not demand constant attention, and the hololithic displays did not transform human lives into clean geometric abstractions. 91,417. The number was precise. The number was accurate. The number was unbearable. I returned to duty 6 hours before my scheduled shift resumption and began processing coordination requirements for the second phase operations. The war continued. The system required my function. I executed my function because I had no acceptable alternative, and because the alternative, allowing myself to fully process what the numbers represented, would render me unable to continue. Corvin understood this better than I did. I would realize that later, during the isolation sequence that followed, when understanding came too late to serve any useful purpose. The second phase of Thunder of Conviction commenced 41 days after the breakthrough. High Command required the operational pause to reposition forces, reinforce supply lines, and reconstitute units that had sustained degradation beyond effective combat capability during the initial assault. My coordination cell spent those 41 days managing the consolidation operations, establishing garrison positions, coordinating patrol routes, processing the steady accumulation of casualties that continued even during what the operational briefs designated as a reduced tempo phase. Reduced tempo meant approximately 700 casualties per day instead of 4,000. The mathematics made it an improvement. The men dying in those reduced tempo engagements would perhaps have calculated differently. Corvin's medical level gradually processed the backlog from the first phase. The overflow casualties that had occupied every available corridor space were either repaired sufficiently for return to duty, evacuated to orbital medical facilities, or processed through the morgue level for mass burial details. His Vox traffic to my station decreased in frequency. The requests for medical evacuation support became routine rather than desperate. The system was recovering its equilibrium, preparing to absorb the next wave of destruction we were already calculating. I did not see him during those 41 days. Our shift transitions no longer aligned. The operational restructuring had placed medical personnel on a different duty cycle to ensure maximum coverage during anticipated high-casualty periods. The recaf dispensary encounters ceased. I told myself this was operationally efficient. Different departments should maintain separation to prevent informal coordination channels from developing outside proper command structure. I told myself I did not miss the conversations that had served no productive function and frequently caused philosophical discomfort. I was not convincing, even to myself, but the operational tempo did not provide space for processing personal responses to absence. The hololithic displays required constant attention. Second phase planning consumed every available processing cycle. I worked through scheduled rest periods, sustained myself on stimulants and nutrient paste, and achieved coordination efficiency ratings that exceeded my previous performance metrics. Strategos Major Caven personally commended my dedication during a command staff briefing on day 33 of the operational pause. He referenced my extended duty hours and exemplary commitment to operational success, despite the significant human costs inherent in siege warfare of this magnitude. The other staff officers acknowledged the commendation with appropriate gestures. I received the recognition without emotional response and returned to my station to continue processing deployment schedules for the second phase assault. The commendation meant I was functioning correctly within the system. It meant I had successfully abstracted the casualty figures into processable data. It meant I had become precisely what the Tactica Imperialis Academy had trained me to become: an efficient, calculating component that could coordinate the deaths of thousands without degrading performance. This should have felt like achievement. Instead, it felt like I did not permit myself to complete that processing pathway. The second phase assault was scheduled to commence in 8 days. I had coordination responsibilities that required my full attention. Personal philosophical assessment would have to wait. It waited 14 months. By then, the context had changed entirely. The second phase assault achieved its objectives in 11 days at a cost of 63,000 additional casualties. Urban center Sigma fell. The enemy withdrew from the urban complex entirely, abandoning the territory rather than sustaining complete annihilation. High Command declared strategic victory. The northern salient offensive was designated operationally complete. Consolidation and garrison operations will continue, but the active siege phase had concluded. Across the Planetary theater, similar outcomes manifested over the following months. The enemy lacked the strength to maintain defensive positions against sustained Imperial pressure. They withdrew to increasingly concentrated defensive zones, trading territory for survival, accepting strategic defeat while preserving enough force coherence to prevent complete destruction. The siege that had consumed 3 years and millions of lives was transforming into an occupation that would consume decades and millions more. My coordination cell transitioned from active offensive operations to garrison support. The work was less intensive but more tedious, managing patrol schedules, coordinating supply distribution to forward positions, processing the routine casualties that accumulated from mines, snipers, and occasional raids against isolated positions. The daily casualty rate declined to double digits, some days single digits. The hololithic display's frantic updating rhythm slowed to occasional adjustments. The war had not ended. It had simply become routine, sustainable, an acceptable background cost for maintaining imperial authority over a contested world. I should have felt relief. The unsustainable casualty rates that had defined my first year had normalized. The constant operational pressure had decreased. I received approval for regular rest cycle compliance rather than continuous duty. I could return to my quarters, consume actual meals in the facility mess hall rather than nutrient paste at my station, engage in the minimal personal maintenance the system required to sustain long-term function. Instead, I felt empty. As if the reduction in operational pressure had removed the framework that sustained my continued function. During the siege's crisis phase, I had maintained focus through necessity. Every moment required calculation, coordination, decision. There was no space for processing the implications of those decisions. Now there was space, and the space was worse than the pressure had been. I began encountering Corvin again. The shift cycle restructuring had reverted to standard rotation. He appeared in the recaf dispensary at the same time he had before, preparing his recaf with the same mechanical precision, but something had changed. His movements were slower. His posture had degraded. When he turned to acknowledge me, his eyes showed the same distance I had begun noticing in my own reflection during the mandatory grooming periods. We did not speak immediately. I prepared my recaf. He stood nearby, holding his cup, not drinking. After a long silence, he spoke without looking at me. 164,792. The number required no explanation. Total casualties processed through the medical level during the Northern Salient Offensive. Wounded, killed, evacuated, returned to duty. All of them had passed through Corvin's triage protocols. All of them had been calculated, categorized, processed. I know the figure, I replied quietly. I processed the same casualty reports from the coordination side. The strategic objective was achieved. The strategic objective was achieved, Corvin repeated, not quite mocking, not quite agreeing, simply stating a fact that required acknowledgement. Urban Center Sigma is ours. The siege is effectively concluded. High Command declares victory, and 164,792 men paid the entry price. He finally drank from his recaf, grimaced slightly. It had cooled beyond optimal temperature, and set the cup aside. I need to tell you something, Cross. Something I've been processing. Something that's been consuming my thought cycle since the offensive concluded. I did not respond, simply waited. Corvin had never requested extended conversation before. His willingness to do so now indicated processing requirements that exceeded his normal parameters. During the worst of the casualty flow, he continued, during those first 4 days, when my surgical bays were overwhelmed and I was performing triage faster than I could think, I developed a system, a calculation method. It wasn't official protocol. It was my own algorithm for deciding who received immediate intervention and who received delayed treatment or comfort-only care. I had to process incoming wounded at a rate that didn't allow for proper individual assessment, so I calculated severity of injury weighted against probability of successful intervention, weighted against expected recovery, timeline weighted against projected return to duty capability. Pure mathematics. I could assess an incoming casualty in 15 seconds and assign them to the appropriate processing category. He paused. When he continued, his voice had changed. Flatter, more distant, the same tonal shift I had noticed in my own coordination reports. The system was efficient. My survival rates were 12% better than the standard triage protocols. I saved lives. Measurably, demonstrably. I received commendation for innovation in high-volume trauma management. And Cross, I have never hated anything more than I hate what I became during those calculations. I understood immediately. He had experienced the same transformation I had, the same conversion of human suffering into processable mathematics. The same optimization of death and survival according to resource availability. He had become, in his medical role, exactly what I'd become in my coordination role, an efficient component executing its function without permitting human consideration to degrade performance. "You performed your duty," I said, knowing the words were insufficient. "You optimized outcomes within the constraints you faced. That is what the system requires." "I know what the system requires." Corvin finally looked at me directly. I executed the system's requirements with exemplary efficiency. And somewhere during that execution, I stopped seeing the wounded as individuals and started seeing them as data requiring processing. The same way you stopped seeing the regiments as men and started seeing them as force allocation units. We both transformed into exactly what this place needed us to become, and I'm not sure. He stopped, restarted. I don't know if I can transform back. I don't know if there's anything to transform back to. The observation was accurate. I'd been avoiding similar recognition, but Corvin's willingness to articulate it made avoidance impossible. We had both crossed thresholds. We had both accepted participation in systematic reduction of human beings to numerical abstractions. We had both done so competently, efficiently, and without allowing moral hesitation to degrade our performance. "We cannot function otherwise," I replied. "The scale of operations here exceeds individual human capacity for emotional processing. Abstraction is necessary for survival, for continued function." "I know," Corvin said, "but necessity doesn't make it, doesn't make us." He did not complete the sentence. Instead, he picked up his cooled recaf and drank the remainder in a single motion. "I shouldn't be telling you this. Sharing existential crises with coordination personnel from a different department is probably several kinds of protocol violation. But you're the only person in this facility who might understand what I'm describing, because you've done the same thing, calculated the same mathematics, made yourself into the same kind of machine." He was correct. And the recognition that someone else understood, that I was not the only person processing this specific variant of horror, provided something I had not expected. Not comfort, not absolution, simply the knowledge that the transformation was not uniquely mine, that the system produced this outcome reliably across multiple personnel categories. "I understand," I said quietly. "I've processed similar recognition regarding my own function. The coordination decisions I transmit result in casualties I can predict with reasonable accuracy. I know that the orders I send will kill men. I know this, and I continue sending the orders because the alternative is refusal of duty, which would simply result in my replacement by another coordinator who would send the same orders. The machine continues regardless of individual participation. We simply choose whether to be components within it or refuse and be replaced. Those aren't choices, Corvin observed. That's just selection between different forms of complicity. Yes, I agreed. But complicity is... Perhaps complicity is all the choice the system permits. We can execute our functions competently or incompetently. We can acknowledge the cost or pretend it doesn't exist. We cannot stop the cost from accumulating. That's not within our authority. Corvin nodded slowly. I suppose that's what I'm trying to do. Acknowledge the cost. Maintain awareness that the numbers represented people. Even if that awareness serves no operational function. Even if it just makes continuing more difficult. It does make continuing more difficult, I replied. Emotional distance is more efficient. The Academy taught us that. The operational data confirms it. Coordinators and Medicae who maintain clinical detachment demonstrate better performance metrics than those who retain emotional engagement. Better performance at what? Corvin asked. At processing death more efficiently? At calculating suffering with greater precision? That's not. He stopped himself. I'm sorry. This isn't productive. You have duties. I have duties. Neither of us changes anything by standing here, having philosophical discussions about our complicity in the machine. He moved toward the corridor leading to the medical level, then stopped, turned back. Cross, if you need someone to acknowledge that what we're doing has costs beyond the casualty reports, that the numbers meant something before they became numbers, I'm available, informally, off the record. It doesn't change anything, but sometimes acknowledgement is all we can manage. He departed before I could formulate a response. I remained at the recaf dispensary, processing the conversation against my operational training. Everything Corvin had said was technically accurate, but operationally counterproductive. Acknowledging the human cost made the function more difficult without improving outcomes. The efficient approach was to maintain the abstraction, process the data, avoid extended processing of moral implications. But efficiency was not the same as sustainability. And I was beginning to recognize that I had been operating beyond sustainable parameters for longer than my performance metrics indicated. The abstraction was fracturing. The calculations that had seemed clean and necessary during the crisis phase now seemed hollow. Accurate but hollow. Mathematically sound but humanly bankrupt. I did not know how to process this recognition. So I returned to my station and resumed coordination duties because continuing the function was easier than confronting what the function had made me. The occupation phase stabilized over the following months. Casualty rates remained low. Operations became routine. The hololithic displays updated with decreasing frequency. My coordination cell's primary function shifted from tactical deployment to administrative logistics, managing supply schedules, coordinating patrol rotations, processing the endless streams of documentation that military bureaucracy required. The work was boring. Boring was a significant improvement over the crisis phase's constant pressure. I should have been grateful. Instead, I began making errors. Small errors, not operationally significant, but errors nonetheless. A supply convoy routed to the wrong grid reference, a patrol schedule submitted with incorrect timing data, a casualty report filed without proper verification. My junior coordinators corrected the mistakes before they caused disruptions, but the pattern was concerning. My performance metrics showed degradation. Not catastrophic degradation, but measurable decline from my previous standards. Strategos Major Caven summoned me to his office on level 13 for performance review. I had been to his office twice before, once during initial briefing, once during commendation after the first phase breakthrough. This meeting had different character. He did not gesture for me to sit, simply stood behind his desk, reviewing a data slate, then looked up with the analytical precision he applied to all personnel assessments. Substrategos Cross. Your performance metrics show decline over the past 4 months. Error rates increasing, coordination efficiency decreasing, response time to Vox traffic extending beyond optimal parameters. Explain. The question was direct. I provided the only answer I could formulate. I've been experiencing difficulty maintaining focus during routine operations, Strategos Major. The transition from crisis phase intensity to occupation phase routine the adjustment has been more difficult than anticipated. I am implementing corrective measures. Corrective measures? Caven set down the data slate. Cross, you coordinated operations that consumed 91,000 casualties without significant performance degradation. You maintained functionality during the highest pressure operational period this theater has experienced. Now that the pressure has decreased, your performance declines. That suggests the crisis phase was not the problem. The absence of crisis is the problem. Explain that. I did not have an explanation that would sound rational in a formal performance review. How could I explain that the constant operational pressure had provided structure that prevented recognition of what I was doing? That reducing the intensity had created space for processing the implications I had been avoiding? That I was beginning to realize the transformation I had undergone was not sustainable across extended timelines without the crisis to justify it? I do not have adequate explanation, Strategos Major, I replied. I am experiencing psychological adjustment difficulties. I will consult with medico-psychological services too. You will not consult with psychological services, Caven interrupted. Psychological services are overwhelmed with frontline personnel demonstrating acute combat stress reactions. Coordination staff who successfully functioned during crisis do not receive priority for therapeutic intervention just because they find routine operations boring. You will adjust. You will restore your performance to previous standards. You will continue executing your function. Are these instructions clear? Clear, Strategos Major. Good. Dismissed. I returned to my station and resumed coordination duties with renewed focus on error prevention. The performance review had been technically correct. I had no justification for degraded performance. The system required my function. I would provide my function at acceptable standards. But the conversation with Caven had clarified something I had been avoiding. The system did not care about sustainability. It cared about function. As long as I executed my role adequately, my internal processing state was irrelevant. I could fracture completely and it wouldn't matter, as long as I continued transmitting coordination orders with acceptable accuracy. This recognition should have been alarming. Instead, it was almost comforting. The system's indifference to my psychological state meant I didn't have to maintain pretense of stability. I simply had to maintain performance. The rest, everything happening beneath the functional surface, could deteriorate without consequence as long as the deterioration remained internal. I began seeing Corvin more frequently. Not coincidentally, deliberately. I modified my routine to ensure our paths crossed at the recaf dispensary, in corridor junctions, during shift transitions. I did not analyze why I was doing this. Analysis would have required confronting needs I was not prepared to acknowledge. Easier to simply allow the pattern to develop without examining its foundation. Corvin noticed. During one encounter at the recaf dispensary, he prepared his usual cup, then prepared a second and handed it to me before I reached the dispenser. "You've been arriving earlier," he observed. 7 minutes earlier than your previous pattern. That's deliberate. Coordinators don't modify schedules without purpose. The modification seemed appropriate, I replied, accepting the recaf. It was prepared exactly to my usual specifications. He had been paying attention to details I had not realized were observable. "Appropriate," Corvin repeated. "That's a very careful word. Very coordinator. What you mean is you wanted to encounter me more frequently, but didn't want to acknowledge that as a conscious desire. So you modified your schedule and labeled it appropriate, rather than admitting you were seeking out human contact." The observation was accurate and uncomfortable. I've been processing certain operational and philosophical questions. You have experience with similar processing. Periodic discussion seems productive. "Productive," Corvin said, but his tone was gentler than the words suggested. "Cross, it's acceptable to admit you need, that you benefit from having someone who understands what you're experiencing. The system trains us to eliminate personal needs, but elimination isn't the same as non-existence. The needs persist. We just learn to hide them under professional terminology." "If I acknowledge the need directly," I replied slowly, "I would have to acknowledge that I am not functioning as efficiently as the system requires, that I have not successfully adapted to my role. That would be problematic." "Only if you believe perfect adaptation is possible," Corvin replied. "I don't think it is. I think the system demands something humans can't actually provide. Perfect execution without human limitation. So we all develop coping mechanisms. We hide our inadequacies under performance metrics. We process our doubts as technical problems requiring solutions. We seek out others who might understand without admitting we're seeking connection rather than information exchange." He was describing exactly what I had been doing. The recognition was simultaneously uncomfortable and relieving. "I am not efficiently adapted to this role," I admitted quietly. "I coordinated the offensive successfully. I achieved all operational objectives, and I have no idea how to continue functioning now that the crisis has passed." The crisis phase gave me justification. Every calculation had immediate purpose. Every coordination decision was necessary for operational success. Now the operations are routine. The decisions are administrative. and I cannot stop calculating the cumulative costs of the decisions I made during the phase when those calculations seemed justified. 91,417, Corven said softly. That's the number you're carrying. Northern salient offensive casualties. The ones that happened because you coordinated the operations that produced them. I did not personally kill them, I replied, knowing the defense was inadequate even as I spoke it. I coordinated force deployments according to strategic directives. High Command determined the operational requirements. I simply translated strategic intent into tactical orders, Corven completed. The same way I simply performed triage according to optimal resource allocation. We both did exactly what the system required. We both functioned efficiently within our roles, and we both carry the weight of what that efficiency cost. You don't have to defend yourself to me, Cross. I'm not accusing you. I'm acknowledging that what you did, what we both did, leaves marks that don't show up in performance reviews. The conversation had exceeded comfortable parameters. I should have terminated it and returned to my duties. Instead, I remained, holding recaf that had cooled beyond optimal temperature, standing in a dispensary junction with a medici officer I barely knew formally, but who somehow understood my internal processing state better than I understood it myself. I don't know how to continue, I said finally. I don't know how to maintain function without the crisis structure that made the function seem necessary. And I don't know how to acknowledge that difficulty without confirming that I am inadequate for my assignment. Corvin was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not inadequate. You're human. Those aren't the same thing, though the system treats them as if they are. And for what it's worth, I don't know how to continue either. I've been executing my function on momentum. Following protocols because following protocols is easier than confronting what I've become. But Cross, maybe we don't have to process this alone. Maybe we can... He paused, seeming to reconsider his phrasing. Maybe we can maintain awareness of each other's existence. As people who understand the same specific variant of horror. Would that be acceptable? The offer was unusual. Personnel in the bunker maintained professional relationships. Coordination across departments was functional, formal, bounded by rank and role. What Corvin was suggesting exceeded those parameters. It implied personal connection, recognition of shared experience beyond operational necessity. I should have declined. Personal connections created vulnerabilities. They introduced variables that complicated efficient function. The Academy had trained us to avoid such complications. That would be acceptable, I replied. Corven's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but a subtle relaxation of the permanent tension that characterized most personnel in the facility. Good. Then I'll continue arriving at this junction at this time, and you'll continue arriving 7 minutes earlier than necessary. And we'll both pretend we're just maintaining professional coordination while actually just existing near someone who understands. He departed toward the medical level. I remained at the junction, processing what had just occurred. I had acknowledged need. I had accepted an offer of connection that served no operational purpose. I had deliberately chosen to maintain a relationship that introduced emotional complexity into a role that demanded emotional sterility. The choice was inefficient. It was probably against protocols I should look up, but wouldn't. And it was the first decision I had made in months that felt like a choice rather than execution of predetermined function. I returned to my station and resumed coordination duties with marginally improved focus. The work remained routine. The hololithic displays continued their slow updates. The casualty reports continued accumulating at sustainable rates. Nothing had changed operationally. But I had someone who understood, someone who carried similar weight, someone who acknowledged the cost without requiring defense or justification. That should not have mattered. It mattered anyway. Over the following months, my performance metrics stabilized, not at my previous peak levels, but at acceptable standards that did not trigger additional review. The errors decreased. The coordination efficiency improved. I implemented structured rest cycles and dietary protocols that sustained cognitive function across extended timelines, and I saw Corvin regularly. Not frequently, perhaps every third day, sometimes longer gaps depending on duty cycle variations, but regularly enough that the pattern became established. We would encounter each other at the recaf dispensary or corridor junctions. We would exchange brief observations about operational status, casualty figures, bureaucratic absurdities. Sometimes longer conversations about the philosophical implications of our roles. Sometimes just silent presence while preparing recaf before returning to our respective stations. The relationship. I did not know what to call it. Not friendship. Friendship implied leisure time and shared interests beyond professional context. We had neither. We were two components in the same machine who had recognized each other's processing states and chosen to acknowledge that recognition. Whatever that was, it mattered. It created stability I had not realized I needed. 17 months into my posting, Corvin told me about the child. We were at the recaf dispensary. Standard encounter, routine timing. I was preparing my usual cup when Corvin arrived and stood silently nearby without initiating his own preparation. His posture indicated processing difficulty. Shoulders tense, expression more distant than usual. I completed my recaf preparation and turned to face him. Corvin, you appear to be experiencing difficulty. Has something occurred? I processed someone this morning, he said without preamble. Civilian casualty from a raid on one of the garrison settlements. Local population caught between our patrols and enemy infiltrators. Standard collateral damage pattern for occupation zones. I waited. Civilian casualties were unfortunate but routine during occupation operations. Corvin had processed thousands of military casualties. Civilian casualties should not represent exceptional difficulty. He was 11 years old, Corvin continued quietly. Took shrapnel from a frag grenade. Both legs unsalvageable, internal injuries. I stabilized him as much as possible and forwarded him for evacuation to orbital medical facilities for augmetic replacement and recovery. Standard protocol for civilian casualties requiring extensive intervention. He finally looked at me directly. He asked me if his mother was alive. She was also caught in the engagement. I checked the casualty logs. She was processed through morgue services this morning. I did not tell him. Standard protocol is to defer family status notification until after critical medical procedures are complete to prevent psychological complications during recovery. So I told him I would check and followed proper protocol and sent him to evacuation with a lie about reviewing family status. I understood immediately why this had affected him more than the routine military casualties. Military personnel understood their role in the machine. They accepted risk as part of function. Civilian casualties, especially children, had no such framework. They were simply caught in machinery designed without consideration for their existence. You followed correct protocol, I said carefully. Immediate family status disclosure could have compromised his psychological stability during transfer. Your decision maximized his recovery probability. I know I followed correct protocol, Corvin replied. I calculated the optimal response and executed it efficiently. I lied to an 11-year-old child who had just lost his legs and his mother so that the evacuation process would flow more smoothly. And Cross, I realized while I was doing it that I had transformed so completely that lying to a wounded child felt like the operationally correct decision. Not morally difficult, not emotionally complicated, just the next item in the processing sequence. He was describing the same transformation I had experienced, the same recognition that efficiency had consumed empathy, that the machine had successfully converted him into a component that processed human suffering without allowing that suffering to degrade function. What would you have done differently? I asked. Not a challenge, a genuine inquiry. If you had told him immediately, he would have experienced acute psychological trauma during transfer. Recovery probability would have decreased. The outcome for him would have been objectively worse. The efficient choice was the correct choice. I know, Corvin said. That's what makes it so. The fact that the efficient choice was technically correct doesn't change what it cost me to make it. Doesn't change the recognition that I have become someone who can calculate optimal outcomes for lying to wounded children without experiencing hesitation. The person I was before this posting, before the siege, before the offensive, before I processed 164,000 casualties. That person would have been horrified by what I've become. Now I'm just functional, efficient, optimized for processing human suffering according to proper protocol. I did not have adequate response. Everything he was describing mirrored my own transformation. I had coordinated operations that killed 91,000 men. I transmitted those coordination orders without hesitation because hesitation would have degraded efficiency. I had become exactly what the system required, a human component that functioned like a machine. We cannot change what we have become, I said finally. We can only decide whether to continue functioning or refuse function, and refusal simply results in replacement by another coordinator, another Medicaid officer, another component that will execute the same functions. The machine continues regardless. I know, Corvin said again. I know continued function is the only rational choice. I know refusal accomplishes nothing. And I know that 11-year-old child is better off because I functioned efficiently rather than allowing emotional response to compromise his care. But Cross, what happens to us when we've calculated so many optimal outcomes that we forget we're supposed to feel something about them? When does efficiency become, when do we stop being human and start being just processes executing in human bodies? The question had no good answer. Perhaps there was no answer at all. We had both crossed thresholds during the crisis phase. We had both accepted transformation into efficient processing components. We had both functioned so effectively that the system commended our performance while we quietly fractured under the weight of what that performance required. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know if we can maintain humanity while executing functions that require systematic elimination of human consideration. I don't know if the transformation is reversible or permanent. I only know that you are, that you retain enough awareness to question what you've become. That suggests the transformation is not complete, that something remains beneath the efficient processing. Corvin's expression shifted slightly. Not relief, but perhaps acknowledgement that the recognition mattered. Something remains. I don't know if that's better or worse. If I had transformed completely, I wouldn't experience this. I would just execute my function efficiently, without the constant awareness that executing efficiently has costs beyond the casualty reports. Would you prefer complete transformation? I asked. To process casualties without awareness of cost? To coordinate operations without recognizing the human implications? He considered for a long moment. No, he finally replied. No. The awareness is painful, constant, sometimes unbearable. But losing it entirely would mean losing whatever fragments of humanity I still carry. I'd rather carry the weight than lose the capacity to recognize what the weight represents, even if recognition serves no operational function, even if it just makes continuing more difficult. I understood completely. I had been processing similar calculation. The efficient path was complete abstraction. Accept the transformation, eliminate the residual human awareness, function as pure process, without emotional complication. But that path meant losing something I was not prepared to lose, even if I could not precisely define what that something was. Then we continue carrying the weight, I said. We maintain awareness, even when awareness is painful. We function efficiently because the system requires it, and we acknowledge to each other that the efficiency costs something the system does not measure. Yes, Corvin agreed quietly. We continue. What else can we do? There was no other answer. We continued our respective functions. We maintained our irregular encounters. We processed our shared recognition that we had become components in a machine that consumed human lives according to mathematical optimization algorithms and called it necessary. The occupation phase extended through seasons I only knew about through the chronometer designations. The surface war continued at sustainable intensity. My coordination cell managed routine deployments and administrative logistics. Corvin's medical level processed the steady accumulation of casualties that occupation operations produced. The bunker maintained its sealed existence 14 kilometers beneath a planetary surface we never saw. 21 months into my posting, the Vox network transmitted priority alert across all command levels. Enemy forces had conducted coordinated raids against multiple garrison positions simultaneously, a significant escalation from the sporadic harassment that had characterized recent months. Initial casualty reports indicated heavy losses among isolated garrison units. High Command designated the situation as potential strategic shift requiring immediate response. My coordination cell activated crisis protocols. We mapped the attack pattern, calculated enemy force concentrations, determined optimal response deployments. The hololithic displays updated rapidly as new data arrived. The tactical chamber's atmosphere shifted from routine monitoring to focused intensity. Personnel who had been processing administrative logistics suddenly transitioned back to combat coordination mode. I transmitted deployment orders to reserve units, coordinated relief forces to engage at threatened positions, calculated support requirements for units under attack. The work was familiar. I had executed these functions countless times during the siege's active phase. My performance metrics were excellent. The coordination proceeded efficiently. But something had changed. During the active siege phase, I had processed coordination decisions without allowing recognition of their human cost to degrade function. Now, after months of carrying the weight Corvin had helped me acknowledge, I could not maintain the same abstraction. Each deployment order I transmitted represented men I was sending into combat. Each coordination decision produced casualties I could predict but not prevent. The mathematics remained valid. The strategy remained sound. But I could no longer process the decisions without simultaneous awareness that I was calculating optimal methods for spending human lives. The operational efficiency degraded marginally, not catastrophically. I continued executing function at acceptable standards. But the calculations took longer. The coordination decisions required additional processing cycles. I was still performing my role. I was just experiencing the cost while doing so. After 16 hours of continuous coordination operations, the crisis phase concluded. Enemy forces withdrew after achieving tactical objectives, destroying supply depots, inflicting casualties, demonstrating continued capability for coordinated operations. Our forces re-established control over the attacked positions. Casualty reports finalized at 3,147 Imperial Guard personnel. The number was precise. The number was accurate. The number represented 3,147 individual human beings who had been functional yesterday and were now processed through casualty accounting systems. I had coordinated the deployments that put them in position to die. I had calculated the optimal response that could not save them because optimal response still required accepting losses that exceeded our ability to prevent. I filed the operational summary and departed my station for scheduled rest cycle. I did not proceed to my quarters. I went to the recaf dispensary and waited. Corvin arrived 11 minutes later, earlier than his usual schedule. His medical level had been processing the casualties from the raids. He looked diminished. Smaller, somehow, as if processing 3,000 casualties in 16 hours had physically compressed him. He saw me waiting and approached without preparing recaf. Simply stood nearby, maintaining silence for long moments before speaking. 3,147, he said quietly. I processed 743 through my trauma bays personally. Triage calculations for all of them. Optimal resource allocation for each case. Efficient, professional, by-protocol execution across the entire event sequence. And cross, I broke. Not publicly. Not operationally. But internally, at some point during hour 12, I realized I was calculating survival probabilities for wounded men while simultaneously wondering whether their deaths would simplify my resource allocation problems. I caught myself thinking that the ones who died en route to my bays were more efficient than the ones who survived long enough to require surgical intervention, because dead requires less processing than wounded. He finally looked at me. I thought that. I processed that calculation. And then I continued executing my function because what else could I do? The wounded kept arriving, and I kept processing them, and somewhere during that processing I transformed into something that could calculate whether death or survival was more operationally convenient. What does that make me? I had no answer. What he was describing was the logical endpoint of the transformation we had both experienced. The complete reduction of human beings to processing efficiency calculations. The final abstraction where death becomes preferable to life, because death requires less resource expenditure. It makes you functional, I said finally. It makes you someone who has adapted so completely to the system's requirements that the system's logic has replaced human consideration. It makes us, exactly what we were trained to become. I don't want to be this, Corvin said, and his voice had changed, less controlled, closer to something that might have been despair, if either of us still permitted ourselves that emotional register. I don't want to calculate whether wounded men dying is more convenient than treating them. I don't want to function efficiently while something inside me fractures with each calculation. But I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to execute my function without the calculations that make executing the function bearable. And I don't know what I'm becoming if I continue. I stepped closer, not touching. That would have exceeded comfortable parameters. But close enough that proximity itself communicated something I could not articulate. You're becoming what this place requires, what the siege required, what the occupation requires. A component that processes suffering efficiently without allowing that suffering to prevent continued function. We are both becoming this. I transmitted coordination orders today that killed men, and while I was doing it, I calculated whether their deaths would simplify logistics planning for subsequent operations. The same transformation. The same fractured calculation while maintaining operational efficiency. Corvin closed his eyes. How do we continue? How do we maintain function while carrying this? I don't know, I admitted. I know that you carry it. I know that I carry it. I know that neither of us carries it alone. That is insufficient, but it is what we have. We stood in silence at the recaf junction while personnel flowed past us, returning to duty stations, processing the same crisis we had just survived. None of them stopped. None of them acknowledged our presence beyond standard corridor navigation. We existed in a small pocket of shared recognition while the machine continued functioning around us. Eventually, Corvin opened his eyes. I need to return. The casualties are still processing through overnight observation protocols. I have responsibilities. As do I replied. But Corvin, I hesitated, processing words I'd never expected to articulate. You are not what you fear you have become. Not completely. The recognition that you should not think those things means some part of you remains that knows the difference between what the system requires and what humanity requires. That part persists, even if it serves no operational function. Even if it only creates additional suffering, it persists. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you. I needed to hear that, even if I don't entirely believe it. He departed toward the medical level. I remained at the junction, processing the conversation, processing my own recognition of what we had both become. Processing the fractured awareness that I was simultaneously a functional coordinator and a person horrified by what functionality required. I returned to my quarters. I did not sleep during the designated rest cycle. I simply existed in darkness, breathing recycled air, listening to the ventilation system's mechanical hum that had become so familiar I usually did not notice it. The hum was constant. The hum was reliable. The hum meant the system functioned. I had become another component producing the same reliable hum. Functional, constant, horrified. The system continued.